The old man leaned close to his grandson's ear and whispered a sentence in a language he was certain no one else in the room could understand. He was wrong. Elena Hart stood only 3 feet away, holding a glass of sparkling water, smiling politely at the family she had just been introduced to, and every single word he said landed in her mind with perfect clarity. He had called her a pig farmer's daughter. He had said it the way a man says something dirty, something that should be scraped off a shoe. He said it in the ancient tongue, the language of his home village, believing it was a secret code that gave him permission to be cruel in public without any consequence at all. Elena did not flinch. She did not let her smile drop even a fraction. She lifted her glass a little higher, took a small sip, and looked out over the crowded ballroom, as if she had heard nothing more than the clinking of ice and the soft hum of conversation around her. But inside, something sharp and cold settled into her chest, and she understood, in that single moment, that the night was about to become a battlefield disguised as a party. The event was an engagement celebration, hosted by the Ashford family in a grand hotel ballroom, with high ceilings and crystal chandeliers that threw soft golden light across white tablecloths and towers of flowers. Elena had been dating Daniel Ashford for almost 2 years, and 3 weeks earlier he had gotten down on one knee in the middle of a quiet park and asked her to marry him. She had said yes before he even finished the sentence. Tonight was meant to be a joyful gathering, a chance for both families to finally meet, to shake hands, to raise glasses, to begin weaving 2 lives into one. But Edmund Ashford, Daniel's grandfather, had other plans. He was a tall man even in his 80s, with silver hair combed back with military precision and a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. He had built the family's fortune from nothing, or so the family story went, and he carried himself like a king surveying a kingdom he alone had built with his bare hands. He did not like surprises, he did not like outsiders, and most of all, he did not like the idea that his favorite grandson was about to marry a woman whose mother, as he had learned from a quiet background inquiry days earlier, ran a modest pig farm 2 states away. He had said the words in the ancient tongue, a dialect spoken only in a small mountain region where his own family had originated generations ago. It was a language that had nearly disappeared from the modern world, spoken now by only a handful of elderly villagers and a few stubborn families who refused to let it die. Edmund was proud of that language. He used it as a wall, a private space, where he could say whatever he wanted without fear of being understood by anyone outside his bloodline. What Edmund did not know, what nobody in that entire ballroom knew except for Elena herself, was that she had spent 2 full years of her life living in a village, almost identical to the one Edmund's family came from. She had not gone there for adventure or curiosity. She had gone there out of love, to care for her own grandmother in the final years of her life, a woman who spoke only the ancient tongue and refused, out of stubborn pride, to speak anything else. Elena had learned the language not from a classroom or a textbook, but from years of sitting beside a dying woman, listening to stories, arguments, prayers, and lullabies, absorbing every sound until the language became a second skin. She said nothing that night. She smiled through introductions. She shook hands with cousins and aunts and family friends. She let Daniel guide her from table to table, with his hand resting warmly on the small of her back, and she carried Edmund's insult quietly inside her chest, like a stone she had decided not to throw yet. She was not a woman who acted out of impulse. She had learned, through a childhood of hard work and long hours on her family's farm, that patience was often the sharpest weapon a person could carry. Daniel noticed something was different in her that night, though he could not name it. She was quieter than usual during dinner, more watchful, her eyes moving across the room with a kind of careful attention that he had never seen from her before. He asked her twice if she was feeling well, and both times she assured him that she was simply tired, that meeting so many new people at once was overwhelming. He accepted the answer because he had no reason not to. He had no idea that his grandfather had just insulted the woman he loved in a language the old man believed was untouchable. Elena's mother, Margaret Hart, had raised her alone on a small farm just outside a quiet rural town. It was not a glamorous life. There were mornings that started before sunrise, feeding animals in the cold, mending fences that had been knocked down by wind or wandering deer, carrying buckets of feed across muddy fields in boots 2 sizes too big because new ones were not in the budget that year. Margaret had worked herself to exhaustion so that Elena could have books, could have a proper school uniform, could have the chance to build a life beyond the farm if she wanted one. And Elena had taken that chance and built something remarkable with it, earning a scholarship to a respected university, studying languages and history with a hunger that surprised even her professors. It was during a break between semesters, when Elena was 22 years old, that she received a phone call telling her that her grandmother, her mother's mother, was gravely ill and living alone in a remote village overseas, a place the family had left behind 2 generations earlier, but never fully severed ties with. Elena made the decision within a single afternoon. She withdrew from her classes for a term, packed a single suitcase, and flew across an ocean to sit beside a woman she barely knew, in a village where the roads were made of packed dirt and the electricity flickered on and off with the weather. Those 2 years changed her in ways she could never fully explain to people who had not lived through something similar. She learned to speak the ancient tongue not as an academic exercise, but as an act of love, translating her grandmother's pain into medicine schedules, her fear into comfort, her memories into stories that Elena promised herself she would never forget. She learned the rhythms of that hard, beautiful, unforgiving life, waking before dawn to help neighbors with their own farms and animals, learning to patch a roof, learning to butcher what needed to be butchered without turning away, learning the proverbs and songs that had been passed down through centuries of hardship and survival. When her grandmother finally passed, peacefully, in her own bed, with Elena holding her hand and whispering the last lullaby the old woman had ever taught her, Elena flew home carrying grief in one hand and an entire hidden language in the other. She never advertised this part of her life. It felt too private, too sacred, to turn into casual conversation at parties or interviews. She kept it folded away, like a letter she reread only when she was alone. Now, standing in a glittering ballroom, while a proud old man insulted her in that very language, believing himself completely safe behind its walls, Elena understood that fate had handed her something rare. She could have exploded right there, could have turned to Edmund Ashford and delivered a furious correction in front of everyone. But she did not. She waited. She watched him move through the room, shaking hands, laughing loudly at his own jokes, accepting compliments about his success and his family legacy, and she filed every second of his performance away for later. Dinner passed in a blur of polite conversation and clinking silverware. Elena sat between Daniel and his cousin, a friendly young woman named Charlotte who chattered happily about wedding planning, venues, flowers, and the kind of dress Elena might want to wear. Elena answered every question with warmth, laughing at the right moments, asking questions of her own, playing the role of the happy bride-to-be, while a quiet storm gathered behind her calm expression. Across the table, Edmund held court with a group of older relatives, telling stories about the family's rise from a small mountain village to a name now printed on office buildings and charity plaques. He spoke with pride about tradition, about bloodlines, about the importance of marrying within one's own social standing to protect what generations before him had built. Every few sentences, his eyes flicked toward Elena, sizing her up, measuring her against some invisible scale only he could see. At one point during dessert, a distant cousin asked Elena, with genuine curiosity, what her family did for work. The table quieted slightly, the way tables sometimes do when a question feels heavier than it should. Elena smiled and answered honestly, without a trace of shame in her voice, that her mother ran a farm, raising pigs among other animals, and that it had been hard, honest work that had put a roof over her head and paid for every book she had ever owned. She said it clearly, without apology, and watched Edmund's jaw tighten just slightly from across the table. He said nothing in that moment. He simply lifted his wine glass, took a slow sip, and turned his attention back to the relative beside him, as if the conversation had never happened. But Elena noticed. She noticed everything that night, storing each glance, each subtle shift in his expression, building a picture of a man who believed his money and his bloodline made him untouchable. Later, as the evening wound down and guests began drifting toward the exits, Daniel pulled Elena aside near a quiet corner of the ballroom, away from the noise. He took both her hands in his and told her, with the kind of sincerity that had made her fall for him in the first place, how happy he was that she had finally met his family, how much he wanted everyone he loved to feel connected to one another. Elena looked into his eyes and felt a wave of tenderness rise in her chest, followed almost immediately by a flash of protectiveness, a fierce instinct to shield this moment, this relationship, from the poison his grandfather had tried to plant. She did not tell him what Edmund had said, not yet. She wanted to understand the full shape of the man she was dealing with before she decided how to respond. She kissed Daniel softly and told him the night had been wonderful, that she was excited to become part of his family. It was not entirely a lie. She was excited about Daniel, about their future, about the life they were building together. She simply had not yet decided what she would do about the man who had tried to poison it before it even began. As they said their goodbyes near the entrance, Edmund approached the couple one final time, offering Daniel a firm handshake and Elena a stiff, formal nod. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and said, in perfectly polite English, that he hoped she would enjoy becoming part of such a distinguished family. There was a faint curve at the corner of his mouth, something between a smile and a challenge, as if he were testing whether she had understood anything at all earlier that evening. Elena held his gaze without blinking. She thanked him warmly for hosting such a lovely evening, her voice smooth and pleasant, giving away absolutely nothing. But as she turned to walk away, she allowed herself, just for a heartbeat, to glance back over her shoulder and meet his eyes one more time, letting the smallest flicker of knowing amusement pass across her face. It was subtle enough that no one else would have noticed, but Edmund noticed. His confident expression flickered, just slightly, a shadow of uncertainty crossing his features before he composed himself again. In the car on the way home, Daniel talked excitedly about the evening, about how well things had gone, about how relieved he was that his family seemed to like her. Elena listened, nodding, offering soft agreement, while her mind replayed Edmund's whispered words over and over. Pig farmer's daughter, said with such casual contempt, such certainty that she would never understand, never be able to answer back, never be able to stand tall in his world. She thought about her mother, waking before dawn every single day for decades, hands cracked from cold water and rope, never once complaining about the life she had chosen in order to give her daughter something better. She thought about her grandmother, dying slowly in a small stone house with no running water some days, teaching Elena a language out of nothing but love and stubbornness, refusing to let an entire heritage vanish quietly into history. She thought about the years she had spent honoring both of those women, carrying their voices inside her like a promise. Edmund Ashford had no idea what he had done. He believed he had simply put an outsider in her place, quietly, safely, in a language that gave him complete protection. He believed the night had ended in his favor. He had no way of knowing that he had just planted the first seed of a confrontation that would reshape his entire family, expose truths he had spent decades hiding, and force him to reckon with a past he had tried desperately to erase. Elena lay awake that night, long after Daniel had fallen asleep beside her, staring at the ceiling, turning the evening over and over in her mind. She was not angry in the loud, explosive way some people become angry. Her anger was quieter than that, colder, more precise. It settled into her like frost forming on a window pane, spreading slowly, covering everything, sharpening the edges of her resolve. She thought about simply letting it go, about choosing peace for the sake of her relationship with Daniel, about deciding that an old man's private cruelty did not deserve a public response. But as she lay there, she kept returning to one simple, undeniable truth. If she said nothing, Edmund would continue believing he could say anything he wanted about her family, about anyone he judged beneath him, as long as he hid behind a language he assumed no one else could touch. Someone needed to show him that his walls were not as solid as he believed. She did not yet know exactly how she would do it. She only knew, with absolute certainty, that the next time Edmund Ashford opened his mouth to insult her in the ancient tongue, she would answer him in the very same language, and the entire room would finally understand exactly what kind of man he truly was. The following morning arrived gray and quiet, rain tapping softly against the windows of the apartment Elena shared with Daniel. She woke before him, as she often did, and sat at the small kitchen table with a cup of tea slowly cooling in her hands, watching the water trace thin lines down the glass. Her mind was still turning over the events of the previous night, replaying Edmund's whispered words, searching for the right moment, the right way, to respond, without destroying the fragile new bond forming between two very different families. She thought of calling her mother, but decided against it, at least for now. Margaret Hart had spent her whole life absorbing quiet insults from people who looked down on farm work. who assumed a woman covered in mud and sweat could not possibly be intelligent, cultured, or worthy of respect. Elena did not want to hand her mother one more story of humiliation to carry, not yet, not until she had a plan that ended in something other than pain. Instead, she opened her laptop and began doing what she did best when she needed clarity: research. She searched for information about the Ashford family history, the region their ancestors had come from, anything publicly available about the mountain village where the ancient tongue was still spoken by a shrinking handful of elders. She wanted to understand not just the language Edmund had used against her, but the deeper story behind it, the roots he was so proud of and yet seemed determined to hide from most of the modern world. What she found surprised her. Buried in an old newspaper archive, digitized years ago and rarely visited, was a short article about a young man named Edmund, who had left his home village decades earlier with almost nothing, seeking a better life in the city. The article was written in the ancient tongue itself, published in a small regional paper that had long since folded. It described a family that had once raised livestock for a living, struggling through difficult seasons, much like the very kind of family Edmund had mocked Elena for coming from. Elena sat back in her chair, staring at the screen, feeling a strange mixture of anger and something close to sympathy. Edmund Ashford, the proud patriarch who spoke of bloodlines and social standing as though they were sacred, had come from humble farming roots himself. He had simply spent decades burying that truth beneath wealth, polish, and carefully curated stories about self-made success through intelligence and hard work alone, conveniently leaving out the parts that did not fit the image he wanted the world to see. She printed the article, though she was not yet certain what she would do with it. She folded it carefully and placed it inside a drawer, alongside old photographs of her grandmother's village, a small collection of proof that history had a way of circling back on people who tried too hard to outrun it. Daniel woke a short while later, padding into the kitchen still half asleep, kissing the top of her head before pouring himself coffee. He asked what she was working on, and she told him only that she was researching wedding traditions from different cultures, which was true enough in a roundabout way. She was not ready to tell him what she had found, not until she understood exactly what she intended to do with it. Over the following days, Elena began noticing small things she had not paid attention to before. Family photographs displayed prominently throughout Daniel's parents' home, portraits stretching back generations, each one polished and framed, as evidence of a lineage worth admiring. She noticed how carefully curated the family's public image was, how often Edmund spoke of legacy, tradition, and the importance of protecting what previous generations had sacrificed to build. She began to understand that his cruelty toward her was not simply about pride. It was about fear, a deep, buried fear, that if people learned the truth about where he came from, the empire he had built around his own image might crumble. She met Daniel's mother, Diane Ashford, for lunch one afternoon, at Diane's invitation. Diane was polished and composed, dressed in a tailored blazer, her hair styled without a single strand out of place. She asked polite questions about Elena's upbringing, her education, her plans for the future, all delivered with a friendly smile that never quite reached her eyes. Elena answered honestly, watching carefully for any flicker of judgment, any subtle sign that Diane shared her father-in-law's prejudice. She found it, quietly, in small comments, that Diane likely did not even realize revealed her true feelings. A remark about how refreshing it was that Elena had worked so hard to rise above her background. A comment about how the family valued partners who understood the importance of refinement and social grace. Elena smiled through each one, filing them away just as she had filed away Edmund's whispered insult, building a clearer and clearer picture of the family she was preparing to join. That evening, Elena finally told Daniel what his grandfather had said. She chose her words carefully, sitting across from him at their small dinner table, watching his expression shift from confusion to disbelief to a slow, dawning anger. He asked her, voice tight, if she was certain she had understood correctly. She told him, calmly, that she had spent 2 years living in a village where that exact language was spoken every single day, that she had learned it while caring for her own dying grandmother, and that she had understood every single word his grandfather said. Daniel sat in silence for a long moment, running a hand through his hair, clearly struggling to reconcile the image of the grandfather who had taught him to fish as a child with the man who had just insulted the woman he loved. He apologized on his grandfather's behalf, though Elena gently reminded him that the apology was not his to give. She told him she did not want him to fight this battle for her. She wanted him to simply stand beside her when the moment came for her to fight it herself. He asked what she planned to do. Elena did not have a complete answer yet, only a growing certainty that silence was no longer an option. She told him only that the next time his grandfather underestimated her, he would learn exactly how wrong he had been, in front of everyone who needed to hear it. Daniel took her hand across the table, his anger softening into something steadier, something closer to respect and quiet admiration. He told her he trusted her completely, that whatever she decided to do, he would stand firmly beside her. It was, Elena realized later, the moment she understood without doubt that she had chosen the right man to build a life with, even if his family still had lessons left to learn. Over the next several weeks, wedding planning moved forward, though a new tension now hummed quietly beneath every family interaction. Edmund remained polite on the surface, his cold formality never quite softening into warmth, while Elena continued to watch, wait, and prepare. She began quietly reaching out to distant relatives from the ancient village her grandmother had come from, gathering old letters, photographs, and stories, weaving together a fuller picture of a heritage that connected far more people in that glittering wealthy family than any of them realized. She was not building a weapon out of hatred. She was building a mirror, one she intended to hold up in front of Edmund Ashford at exactly the right moment, so that he would finally be forced to see himself clearly, without the polish, without the carefully constructed lies, without the language he had once believed would protect him forever. The engagement party had been the first spark, but the true fire, Elena knew, would need a proper stage. She began paying closer attention to the family calendar, the long list of gatherings that filled the Ashford household throughout the year: birthdays, anniversaries, charity galas, holiday dinners. She was looking for the right moment, one with enough witnesses that Edmund could not simply dismiss what happened as a private disagreement between two people, but not so public that it became a spectacle disconnected from its true meaning. She found her answer in an invitation that arrived 3 weeks later, printed on heavy cream cardstock with elegant gold lettering. The Ashford family was hosting a formal engagement dinner, smaller than the earlier party but still significant, meant to formally welcome Elena into the family circle in front of close relatives, longtime family friends, and a few respected business associates, whose opinions clearly mattered a great deal to Edmund. It was, Elena realized immediately, exactly the kind of setting where a man like Edmund would feel most comfortable, most in control, most certain of his own authority. She spent the days leading up to the dinner in quiet preparation, though nothing about her outward behavior suggested anything unusual was happening. She continued helping Daniel with wedding details, continued smiling through family phone calls, continued behaving like a woman simply excited about her future. But in private moments, late at night or during quiet mornings while Daniel slept, she reviewed everything she had gathered: the old newspaper article about Edmund's humble origins, the proverbs and phrases her grandmother had taught her, the rhythms of a language built for both tenderness and confrontation. She reached out once more to a distant cousin she had found through her research, a woman named Rosalind, who still lived near the mountain village and remembered Edmund's family from decades earlier, before wealth and reinvention had erased every trace of where they came from. Rosalind was delighted to hear from someone who still valued the old language and the old stories, and she happily shared memories of Edmund's parents, hard-working farmers who had raised sheep and goats on land barely large enough to survive. Memories that painted a picture entirely different from the polished legacy Edmund now presented to the world. Elena did not plan to attack Edmund with cruelty simply to match his own. She was not interested in humiliation for its own sake. What she wanted, more than anything, was for him to understand, clearly and undeniably, that the wall he had built between himself and his own history was an illusion, and that the woman he had tried to belittle understood that history far better than he assumed. The night of the dinner arrived, cool and clear, the kind of evening where the sky deepened into a rich shade of blue, just as the first stars appeared. Elena dressed carefully, choosing a deep emerald gown that Daniel told her made her look like she belonged in an old portrait, timeless and elegant. She fastened a small silver pendant around her neck, one her grandmother had given her years earlier, a tiny detail of quiet defiance that no one in that room would understand the significance of except her. The Ashford estate, where the dinner was held, sat on several acres of manicured grounds. The main house built from pale stone, with tall windows glowing warmly from within, as guests began to arrive. Elena walked beside Daniel up the wide stone steps, her arm looped through his, her expression calm and composed, despite the storm gathering quietly beneath her surface. Inside, the dining room had been transformed into something out of an old-world painting. Long tables draped in ivory linen, candlelight flickering against polished silverware, fresh flowers arranged in tall glass vases. Guests mingled near the entrance, exchanging greetings and light conversation, the air thick with perfume, cologne, and the low hum of polite laughter. Edmund stood near the head of the room, dressed impeccably as always, greeting guests with a firm handshake and a broad, practiced smile. When he spotted Elena and Daniel approaching, his expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something calculating passing behind his eyes, before the smile returned, smooth and unreadable. He greeted Daniel warmly, clasping his shoulder with genuine affection, before turning to Elena with a far more measured politeness. Dinner began with the usual formalities, toasts to the happy couple, warm words from Daniel's parents, laughter shared over old family stories. Elena participated fully, laughing at the right moments, answering questions with warmth and grace, playing her role perfectly, while watching Edmund carefully from across the table, waiting. It happened during the second course, as servers cleared plates and refilled wine glasses. A business associate seated near Edmund, a man named Gregory who clearly admired the family patriarch a great deal, asked Edmund to share the secret behind his remarkable success, the story of how he had built such an impressive legacy from the ground up. Edmund straightened in his chair, visibly pleased by the question, and began telling a story Elena suspected he had told hundreds of times before, a tale of brilliance, determination, and natural talent that had carried him from modest beginnings to extraordinary wealth, carefully omitting any specific detail about what those modest beginnings actually looked like. As he spoke, his eyes drifted toward Elena, and something in his expression shifted, a subtle challenge, an invitation almost, as if he wanted her to understand that this was his world, his story, his stage, and she was merely a guest, allowed to watch. He finished his story with a flourish, and the table erupted in polite applause and admiring murmurs. Then, leaning slightly toward Daniel with a faint smile, Edmund said something quietly in the ancient tongue, clearly believing once again that his words were shielded from every ear in the room except his grandson's. This time, the comment was sharper, crueler than before. He questioned aloud whether a woman raised among livestock and mud could ever truly understand the weight of the legacy she was marrying into, whether she would embarrass the family name at future gatherings among people of true refinement. The table continued its light chatter, oblivious, while Daniel's face flushed with visible discomfort, unsure how to respond to his grandfather's words in front of everyone. But Elena, seated just beside them, set down her wine glass with deliberate calm, and turned her head toward Edmund. And then, in the same ancient tongue, with perfect pronunciation, flawless grammar, and a steady, unwavering voice, she responded. She told him, in a language built centuries earlier for both poetry and hard truths, that she understood every word he had just said, that she had understood every word he said weeks earlier at the engagement party as well, and that she found it curious that a man so proud of legacy and refinement had spent decades hiding the fact that his own hands had once smelled of the same barns and fields he now looked down upon in others. The room fell into stunned silence. For a long moment, nobody at the table moved. Forks hovered halfway to mouths. Conversations at nearby seats trailed off, as guests noticed the sudden shift in atmosphere, sensing that something important had just happened, even if they could not understand the words themselves. Edmund's face had gone pale, then quickly flushed a deep red, his composed expression cracking for the first time that evening, revealing something raw and unguarded underneath. He opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it again, clearly searching for words that would not come. Daniel sat frozen beside Elena, his eyes wide with shock, glancing rapidly between his grandfather and his fiancée, trying to process what he had just witnessed. Diane Ashford, seated further down the table, leaned forward with sharp curiosity, sensing conflict but not yet understanding its source. Elena continued speaking, her voice calm and measured, never rising in volume, never cracking with anger, though every word carried unmistakable weight. She told Edmund, still in the ancient tongue, about her grandmother, about the small stone house with no running water, about the years she had spent learning that very language, while caring for a dying woman who had refused to let an entire heritage disappear from the world, simply because it had become inconvenient for wealthier descendants to remember. She told him about a newspaper article she had found, written decades earlier in that same language, describing a young man who had left a small mountain village with nothing but the clothes on his back and a determination to reinvent himself completely. A young man whose family had raised livestock on land too small to comfortably support them. She did not need to say his name. The way his hands tightened around his wine glass told her he understood exactly whose story she was describing. A few guests near the head of the table, ones who happened to share distant roots in that same region and had grown up hearing fragments of the old language from grandparents of their own, began to realize what was happening, their expressions shifting from confusion to something closer to fascination. One older woman, a longtime family friend named Harriet, actually smiled, a small knowing smile, as though she had always suspected there was more beneath Edmund's polished surface than he ever let on. Edmund finally found his voice, though it came out sharper and less controlled than his usual smooth delivery. He switched back to English, his tone clipped, insisting that Elena was twisting old family stories, that she had no right to speak about matters she did not fully understand. But his voice lacked its usual confidence, and the tremor beneath his words was impossible to miss for anyone paying close attention. Elena did not raise her voice to match his. She simply looked at him steadily and said, in English now, loud enough for the entire table to hear clearly, that she was not ashamed of where she came from, that her mother had worked harder than almost anyone she had ever known, waking before dawn, every single day for decades, to build a life good enough to hand down to her daughter. She said she found it strange that a man who had once lived the very same life somehow believed that hard work and humble beginnings were something to hide, rather than something to honor. The silence that followed felt different from the shocked silence a few moments earlier. This silence carried weight, reflection, the sound of an entire room quietly reconsidering everything they thought they knew about the man at the head of the table. Gregory, the business associate who had asked Edmund about his success only minutes earlier, cleared his throat awkwardly and asked, in a careful tone, whether what Elena said was true. Edmund did not answer immediately. He stared down at his plate, his jaw tight, his hand still gripping his wine glass as though it were the only thing keeping him anchored to his seat. Daniel finally spoke, breaking the tension in his own quiet way. He reached over and took Elena's hand beneath the table, a small gesture of solidarity that did not go unnoticed by the guests seated closest to them. He told the table, gently but firmly, that he had always believed hard work and honesty mattered more than polished stories, and that he was proud, deeply proud, of the woman sitting beside him, regardless of where she came from, or what her family did for a living. Edmund's eyes flicked toward his grandson, something complicated passing across his features, pride and shame tangled together in a way that seemed to genuinely surprise him. For a man who had spent decades controlling every narrative about himself, being exposed so completely, so publicly, by someone he had underestimated, left him visibly shaken. The rest of the dinner passed in an uneasy blend of forced normalcy and lingering tension. Conversations resumed, though quieter and more careful than before, guests exchanging glances that suggested they understood a significant shift had just occurred, even if they did not know every detail. Edmund excused himself before dessert was served, claiming a headache, retreating to his study, while the rest of the family continued the evening without him. Elena remained composed throughout, accepting quiet words of admiration from a few guests who approached her discreetly, including Harriet, who squeezed her hand warmly and told her, with a knowing smile, that it was long overdue for someone to remind Edmund Ashford that pride built on hiding the truth was never as sturdy as it looked. Diane Ashford, however, remained noticeably cold throughout the rest of the evening, her earlier polite curiosity replaced by something guarded and distant. She said little to Elena for the remainder of the dinner, her expression unreadable, leaving Elena with the uncomfortable sense that while one battle had just been won, a larger, more complicated one was only beginning to take shape. As Daniel drove them home later that night, the car quiet except for the soft hum of the engine and the occasional passing headlights, he finally broke the silence, asking Elena how long she had known his grandfather's true history. She told him everything, from the whispered insult at the engagement party to the weeks of quiet research that followed, watching his expression shift through disbelief, admiration, and finally, a kind of steady resolve. He told her he was not angry that she had kept it from him. He understood why she had needed time to prepare, why she had wanted to face his grandfather on her own terms, rather than turning the confrontation into something messy and reactive. He told her, taking her hand once more as they stopped at a red light, that watching her stand her ground that evening had been one of the proudest moments of his life. But he also admitted, quietly, that he worried about what would come next. His grandfather was not a man who handled humiliation gracefully, and his mother's cold silence throughout the evening suggested that the Ashford family's reaction to Elena's revelation was far from finished unfolding. Daniel's worry proved justified within days. The morning after the dinner, his phone buzzed relentlessly, with messages from relatives who had witnessed the confrontation firsthand, and could not resist sharing the story with those who had missed it. By afternoon, the tale had spread through the extended Ashford family like fire through dry grass, each retelling adding new details, some accurate, some wildly exaggerated, until the story barely resembled what had actually happened at that quiet, candlelit table. Edmund remained locked away in his study for most of the following week, refusing calls from concerned relatives, canceling a scheduled golf outing with longtime friends, avoiding the office where he still technically served as chairman of the family business, despite having mostly stepped back from daily operations years earlier. His assistant reported that he seemed unusually quiet, distracted, nothing like the confident, commanding presence everyone had grown accustomed to over the decades. Diane Ashford, meanwhile, took a different approach entirely. Rather than retreating, she became sharper, more deliberate, scheduling a private lunch with Daniel without inviting Elena, something that had never happened before in their 2 years together. Daniel told Elena about the invitation the moment he received it, both of them understanding immediately that his mother intended to use the meeting to express concerns she had clearly been holding back since the engagement party weeks earlier. The lunch took place at a quiet restaurant downtown, the kind of place with soft lighting and hushed conversation, favored by people who preferred privacy over atmosphere. Diane arrived early, already seated when Daniel walked in, her expression composed but tight around the edges, in a way he recognized from childhood, the look she wore whenever she was preparing to say something she believed was important, but knew would not be well received. She began gently enough, asking about wedding preparations, about how Daniel was feeling about the upcoming marriage, small talk that gradually narrowed toward its true purpose. She told him she respected Elena's intelligence, her resourcefulness, even admitted, somewhat reluctantly, that what Elena had done at dinner took a certain kind of courage. But she worried, she said, about the long-term consequences of marrying someone from such a different background, about how Elena would fit into the social circles the family had spent generations building, about whether their children would grow up caught between two very different worlds. Daniel listened patiently, though something inside him grew increasingly firm with each passing minute. When his mother finally finished, he told her calmly but clearly that he understood. Her concerns came from a place of love, but that he would not allow anyone, including her, to suggest that Elena was somehow less worthy of respect because of where she came from. He reminded his mother, gently but pointedly, that the family's own history was far less polished than the version she had spent years presenting to the world. Diane's composure faltered slightly at that, her eyes narrowing as she asked what exactly he meant. Daniel told her about the newspaper article Elena had found, about Edmund's true origins, about a family history built on the same hard, humble labor Diane now seemed determined to distance herself from. He watched his mother's face shift through several emotions at once, surprise, defensiveness, and finally something quieter, more reflective, as though pieces of a puzzle she had never fully examined were suddenly falling into place. She admitted after a long silence that she had always sensed there were parts of her father's history he preferred not to discuss, stories that ended abruptly whenever she asked too many questions as a child. She had simply never pushed hard enough to uncover the full truth, choosing instead to accept the polished version he offered, the version that made their family's success feel inevitable rather than hard-won through struggle and reinvention. The lunch ended without full resolution, but something had shifted nonetheless. Diane did not apologize outright. was not yet ready to fully embrace Elena as the daughter-in-law she had once hoped for, but she agreed, quietly, to think more carefully about the assumptions she had been carrying, without ever fully examining them. Back at Elena and Daniel's apartment that evening, Daniel recounted the conversation in detail, watching relief and cautious hope spread across Elena's face as he described his mother's shifting expression. Elena appreciated the update, though she remained realistic, understanding that changing decades of ingrained belief rarely happened in a single conversation, no matter how honest or well-intentioned. Meanwhile, whispers continued, moving through the extended family, some sympathetic to Elena, admiring her courage and her deep connection to a heritage many of them had let slip away through generations of comfortable distance from their roots. Others sided firmly with Edmund, viewing Elena's public correction as disrespectful, an embarrassment inflicted on a proud elderly man in front of people whose opinions mattered deeply to the family's social standing. A cousin named Peter, close in age to Daniel, and known throughout the family for his blunt honesty, called Daniel directly to share his own perspective. He told Daniel that he had always found something uncomfortable about the way Edmund spoke of legacy and refinement, always suspected there was more beneath the surface than the polished stories suggested. He admitted, with a laugh, that he almost admired Elena for finally saying aloud what several family members had quietly wondered about for years, but never had the courage or the evidence to confront directly. Not every relative felt so generous. An aunt named Beverly, known for her sharp tongue and unwavering loyalty to Edmund, sent Daniel a lengthy message expressing her disappointment, accusing Elena of humiliating a respected elder, simply to prove a point, suggesting that regardless of any hidden history, public confrontation was never an acceptable way to handle family disagreements. Daniel found himself, for the first time in his life, standing at odds with parts of his own family, forced to choose repeatedly between loyalty to relatives he had known his entire life and loyalty to the woman he loved and intended to spend the rest of his life beside. Each conversation left him slightly more resolved, slightly more certain that the family he was building with Elena mattered more than preserving an image built on decades of careful omission. Elena, watching him navigate these difficult conversations with growing steadiness, felt something deepen in her love for him, a recognition that he was not simply a passive bystander in this unfolding story, but an active partner, willing to stand firmly beside her, even when it strained relationships he had cherished his entire life. Edmund himself remained largely silent throughout this period, avoiding both Elena and Daniel entirely, communicating with the rest of the family only through brief, formal messages that gave away nothing about his internal state. But those closest to him noticed subtle changes, a quietness during family calls, a hesitance in his usual booming confidence, small cracks appearing in the carefully constructed image he had spent decades perfecting. It was Rosalind, the distant cousin Elena had connected with weeks earlier, who unexpectedly provided the next significant piece of the unfolding story, reaching out to Elena with old photographs she had discovered while sorting through her own late mother's belongings, images that would soon become impossible for Edmund Ashford to deny or explain away. The photographs arrived in a plain envelope, sent by mail rather than digitally, exactly as Rosalind had promised. Elena opened it at the kitchen table one quiet morning while Daniel showered, and found inside a small stack of black and white images, their edges worn soft with age, corners bent from decades of handling. She spread them carefully across the table, studying each one with growing fascination. The first photograph showed a small stone farmhouse surrounded by open fields, a modest structure with a thatched roof and a wooden fence enclosing a yard where several goats grazed lazily in the sun. Standing in front of the house was a family of 5, dressed in simple, practical clothing, squinting slightly against the light. Elena recognized him immediately, despite his young age in the photograph. A lean teenage boy, standing at the edge of the group, his expression serious, almost defiant, as though he already sensed the world owed him something grander than the life stretching out before him. The second photograph showed the same boy, now perhaps 17 or 18, standing beside a cart loaded with sacks of grain, his hands rough and calloused even at that young age, his clothes patched at the knees and elbows. On the back of the photograph, faded pencil handwriting identified him by his full birth name, a name Elena had never heard before, one that had clearly been changed at some point during his journey toward reinvention. Rosalind had included a short letter along with the photographs, explaining that her own mother and Edmund had grown up as childhood friends before he left the village permanently in his early 20s, never to return. According to family memory passed down through Rosalind's side, Edmund had left under difficult circumstances, following a particularly harsh drought that had devastated the small farming community, forcing many families deeper into poverty and desperation. He had left with almost nothing, determined never to return to a life defined by hunger, hard labor, and uncertainty. Rosalind's letter also mentioned something Elena had not previously known, that Edmund had legally changed his surname shortly after arriving in the city, adopting the more polished-sounding Ashford in place of his original family name, a name that still existed among distant relatives scattered throughout the mountain region, a name that, if traced carefully, connected directly back to the very same humble farming lineage he now looked down upon so completely. Elena sat with the photographs for a long time after Daniel emerged from the shower, watching his expression shift from curiosity to genuine astonishment as she explained what she had discovered. He picked up the image of his grandfather as a teenager, studying it closely, searching for traces of the man he had known his entire life within the thin, tired face of that young farm boy staring back at him from across the decades. He admitted, quietly, that he had never once questioned the story his grandfather told about his rise to success, had simply accepted it as fact, the way children often accept the stories adults tell about themselves. Seeing tangible proof of a completely different history left him feeling unsettled, as though the foundation of something he had always taken for granted had shifted slightly beneath his feet. Elena did not push him toward any particular reaction. She understood how disorienting it could be to discover that a family narrative, repeated confidently for decades, was built on careful omissions rather than outright lies, a distinction that felt important, even as the effect remained similarly deceptive. She simply sat beside him, letting him process the discovery at his own pace, offering quiet support rather than pressure. That evening, Daniel made a decision that surprised even himself. He called his grandfather directly, something he had avoided doing since the dinner weeks earlier, and asked if they could meet privately. Just the two of them, without the rest of the family present. Edmund agreed, his voice guarded, but not entirely closed off, perhaps sensing that continued silence was no longer a sustainable strategy. They met the following afternoon at Edmund's private study, the same room he had retreated to after the confrontational dinner, filled with leather-bound books, framed awards, and photographs documenting decades of business success. Daniel brought the old photographs with him, setting them carefully on the desk between them, watching his grandfather's face carefully for any reaction. Edmund stared at the images for a long moment, his expression unreadable at first, before something in his posture seemed to deflate slightly, the confident, commanding presence he usually carried replaced by something older, wearier, more human. He picked up the photograph of the young boy standing beside the loaded cart, running his thumb gently across the worn edge, silence stretching between grandfather and grandson for several long minutes. Finally he spoke, his voice quieter than Daniel had ever heard it, admitting that yes, everything Elena had said was true. He told Daniel about the drought, about watching his own parents grow thin and desperate trying to keep the family farm alive, about the shame he had carried for years afterward, believing that poverty itself was something shameful, rather than simply circumstances beyond anyone's control. He admitted that he had spent his entire adult life running from that shame, building wealth and status as armor, against ever feeling that powerless again. He explained, haltingly, that when he heard about Elena's background, something old and painful had resurfaced within him, an instinctive, unexamined fear that association with poverty, even by marriage, might somehow drag his family back toward the very desperation he had spent decades escaping. He admitted it was irrational, cruel even, but explained that fear rarely operated according to logic or fairness. Daniel listened carefully, understanding for the first time the complicated psychology behind his grandfather's cruelty, though understanding did not equal excusing what had happened. He told Edmund gently but firmly that his fear, however understandable its origins, had caused real harm, had insulted a woman who deserved nothing but respect, had nearly damaged a relationship Daniel valued more than almost anything else in his life. Edmund nodded slowly, staring down at the photographs still spread across his desk, and admitted, in a voice heavy with something close to genuine remorse, that he owed Elena an apology, a real one, not the polite formal nod he had offered weeks earlier at the engagement party. He asked Daniel, somewhat uncertainly, whether Elena would even be willing to hear him out after everything that had happened. Daniel told him honestly that he did not know, that Elena would need to decide that for herself, but that if his grandfather was truly sincere, he should be prepared to say whatever needed to be said, without expecting forgiveness in return. Edmund absorbed this quietly, nodding again, and asked Daniel to arrange a meeting, just the two of them this time, Edmund and Elena, so that he could finally speak with her directly and honestly, without the protective distance of a foreign language, or the audience of a crowded dinner table. Elena considered the request carefully before agreeing to it. She had no interest in humiliating Edmund further, no desire to extract a dramatic apology simply for the satisfaction of watching a proud man bend. What she wanted, more than anything, was honesty, a genuine reckoning, rather than a performance designed to smooth things over for the sake of family harmony. She told Daniel she would meet his grandfather, but on her own terms, in a place where she felt comfortable and equal, rather than within the imposing walls of his private study, where he had held court for decades. She suggested a quiet park near her apartment, a place with wide-open paths and old oak trees, somewhere far removed from the polished formality of the Ashford estate. Edmund agreed without hesitation, arriving on the appointed afternoon dressed more casually than Elena had ever seen him, a simple sweater replacing his usual tailored suit, his silver hair slightly less precise than usual, as though even his physical presentation had softened along with his intentions. They walked together along a paved path bordering a small lake, ducks gliding lazily across the water, children laughing somewhere in the distance on a nearby playground. For several minutes, neither spoke, the silence stretching between them, comfortable in its own strange way, both of them seeming to understand that whatever needed to be said deserved patience rather than rushed words. Finally, Edmund broke the silence, speaking first in careful English, before switching, almost instinctively, into the ancient tongue, as though some part of him understood that the deepest truths between them needed to be spoken in the language that had started this entire journey. He told Elena about his childhood in vivid detail, the drought that had devastated his family's small farm, the humiliation of watching neighbors whisper about his family's growing poverty, the moment he had decided, at barely 20 years old, that he would rather die than return to that life of hunger and helplessness. He told her about arriving in the city with almost nothing, sleeping in shared rooms with a dozen other desperate young men, working exhausting hours at whatever jobs he could find, slowly building connections, slowly building capital, slowly reinventing himself piece by piece, until the frightened, hungry farm boy disappeared entirely beneath layers of wealth and polish. He admitted that somewhere along that long journey, he had convinced himself that hiding his origins was not dishonesty but survival, a necessary sacrifice to protect the family he eventually built from ever experiencing the desperation he had known. Elena listened without interrupting, letting him speak fully, understanding intuitively that this confession had likely been building inside him for decades, waiting for the right moment, the right person, to finally release it. When he finished, he turned to look at her directly, his eyes uncharacteristically vulnerable, and told her plainly that he was sorry, deeply sorry, for the words he had spoken about her, for the fear and pride that had driven him to insult a woman who, in truth, embodied everything he had once valued, before shame taught him to bury it. He asked her, quietly, why she had chosen to learn the ancient tongue in the first place, genuinely curious rather than defensive, seeming to recognize that her connection to that language represented something he himself had abandoned. Elena told him about her grandmother, about the 2 years she had spent in that remote village, about learning not just words, but an entire way of understanding the world, patience, resilience, the quiet dignity found in hard work, regardless of how society chose to value it. She told him she did not blame him for wanting to escape poverty, for wanting a better life for himself and his descendants. What troubled her, she explained carefully, was not his ambition, but his shame, the way he had allowed fear to convince him that his origins were something to hide rather than something to honor, the way that shame had curdled into cruelty, directed at someone who had never done anything except exist as a living reminder of the life he had chosen to bury. Edmund absorbed her words silently, staring out across the lake for a long moment before speaking again. He told her that he had spent so many years running from his past, that he had forgotten how to look at it honestly, how to separate genuine pride in his own hard work from irrational shame about where that work had begun. He asked her, somewhat hesitantly, whether she believed a person could truly change after decades of building an identity around denial. Elena considered the question seriously before answering. She told him that change was always possible, but that it required more than a single apology, however sincere. It required consistent honesty going forward, a willingness to acknowledge his full history, rather than continuing to hide it. A genuine effort to model for future generations of his family that dignity came from character and hard work, not from erasing inconvenient truths about the past. They continued walking as the afternoon light softened toward evening, the conversation gradually shifting from confession toward something resembling genuine connection. Edmund asked Elena about her grandmother's stories, listening with real interest as she shared memories of village life, old proverbs, songs sung during long winter evenings. For the first time since they had met, he seemed genuinely present rather than performing, his usual guarded formality replaced by quiet curiosity and something close to nostalgia. By the time they parted ways near the park entrance, something fundamental had shifted between them. Edmund did not ask for immediate forgiveness, understanding that trust needed to be rebuilt gradually, rather than granted instantly through a single honest conversation. Elena, for her part, did not offer false reassurance, but she did extend a measure of cautious openness, telling him that she was willing to give their relationship an honest chance to grow, provided his words continued to be matched by his actions going forward. She returned home that evening and told Daniel everything, watching relief and quiet hope spread across his face as she described the conversation. He admitted he had worried the meeting might end in further conflict rather than genuine reconciliation, and he expressed deep gratitude that Elena had been willing to extend that opportunity to his grandfather, despite everything that had happened. News of the private meeting eventually spread through the extended family, though Elena and Edmund both remained deliberately vague about the specific details shared between them, understanding that some conversations deserved privacy, rather than becoming fuel for further family gossip. What could not be hidden, however, was the visible change in Edmund's demeanor over the following weeks, a softening around the edges of his usual formal composure, occasional moments where he spoke more openly about his childhood during family gatherings, small but unmistakable signs that something significant had shifted within him. Diane Ashford noticed the change in her father immediately, and it prompted her own quiet reckoning, a series of long conversations between father and daughter that finally revealed the full truth she had sensed but never fully understood throughout her entire childhood. The revelation reshaped her own understanding of her family's history, and gradually, cautiously, she began extending toward Elena the same kind of openness her father had slowly begun to embrace. Not everyone in the family embraced this new openness so easily. Beverly, the sharp-tongued aunt who had criticized Elena for publicly correcting Edmund at the dinner weeks earlier, remained firmly unconvinced that any of this newfound honesty was worth celebrating. She had built her own sense of identity around the polished version of the family history, the story of effortless success and inherited refinement, and she resented what she saw as Elena unraveling something valuable simply to prove a point. Her resentment came to a head at a family barbecue held at Edmund's estate several weeks later, a more casual gathering meant to celebrate the arrival of summer, with long tables set up across the lawn, children running between adults with plates of food, laughter and music drifting through the warm evening air. Elena arrived with Daniel, feeling more relaxed than she had at any previous family event, the earlier tension between herself and Edmund now replaced by something resembling genuine warmth. Edmund greeted her personally near the entrance, surprising several guests by embracing her warmly rather than offering his usual formal handshake, a gesture that did not go unnoticed by the sharper-eyed relatives scattered across the lawn. He introduced her to several guests she had not yet met, speaking openly about her intelligence, her resourcefulness, and even, to Daniel's quiet astonishment, mentioning briefly, and without shame, that her connection to the ancient tongue had reminded him of important truths about his own upbringing he had long neglected to honor. Beverly watched this exchange from a distance, her expression tightening with visible displeasure. Later in the evening, after several glasses of wine had loosened her usual careful diplomacy, she approached Elena directly near the dessert table, her voice sharp enough to draw the attention of nearby guests. She told Elena, with thinly veiled contempt, that she found it remarkable how quickly an outsider had managed to reshape decades of family tradition and reputation simply by embarrassing an elderly man in public. Elena remained composed, though she felt Daniel tense beside her, ready to intervene. She told Beverly calmly that she had never intended to embarrass anyone, that she had simply refused to remain silent while being insulted in a language someone assumed she could not understand. She reminded Beverly, gently but firmly, that the true embarrassment lay not in her response, but in the original cruelty that had prompted it. Beverly's face flushed with anger, and she opened her mouth to respond sharply, but before she could continue, Edmund himself approached, having overheard enough of the exchange to understand what was happening. He placed a steady hand on Beverly's shoulder and told her, in front of the small cluster of guests who had gathered nearby, that Elena had done nothing wrong, that the fault for everything that had happened rested entirely on his own shoulders, and that he would not tolerate anyone in his family continuing to treat her with disrespect. The lawn fell quiet for a moment, guests exchanging surprised glances, clearly unaccustomed to witnessing Edmund defend anyone so directly, let alone someone he had once dismissed so cruelly. Beverly stared at him, stunned, before muttering a stiff apology and retreating toward the house, her pride visibly wounded but her opposition, for the moment at least, silenced. Daniel squeezed Elena's hand beneath the table later that evening, telling her quietly how proud he was of the strength she continued to show, even in moments when confrontation could have easily been avoided by simply staying silent. Elena admitted that avoiding confrontation had never truly felt like an option for her, not after everything her mother and grandmother had sacrificed to give her the confidence to stand tall regardless of circumstance. Not everyone in the family fully softened toward her, and Elena understood that some relationships would likely remain distant or cool, regardless of how much time passed. But she found comfort in the fact that the people who mattered most, Daniel, Edmund, and gradually Diane as well, had chosen honesty and connection over pride and denial. That, she realized, was worth far more than universal approval from an entire extended family. As summer turned toward autumn, wedding preparations accelerated, venue details finalized, dresses fitted, invitations sent to family and friends scattered across the country and beyond. Elena's mother, Margaret, finally met the Ashford family in person, during a smaller gathering, arranged specifically to bring both families closer together before the wedding itself. Margaret arrived nervous but composed, dressed simply but neatly, clearly uncertain how she would be received by a family whose wealth and social standing so dramatically outmatched her own modest life on the farm. Edmund greeted her personally at the door, surprising everyone once again, by speaking to her, not with condescension, but with genuine warmth and curiosity, asking detailed questions about farm life, about the animals she raised, about the daily rhythms of a life he himself had once known intimately, before choosing to bury it beneath decades of reinvention. Margaret, initially guarded, gradually relaxed as the conversation continued, recognizing something familiar and unexpectedly kind in Edmund's manner, despite his obvious wealth and polish. By the end of the evening, the two of them were seated together on the porch, sharing stories about difficult harvests, stubborn livestock, and the particular satisfaction of hard, honest labor, laughing together in a way that Elena could hardly have imagined possible just months earlier. Watching her mother and Daniel's grandfather bond so naturally, Elena felt a wave of quiet emotion rise within her, a recognition that the painful confrontation months earlier had ultimately led toward something far more valuable than mere reconciliation. It had led toward genuine understanding, toward two families discovering common ground they might never have found without the difficult honesty that Elena's courage had first forced into the open. As the wedding date drew closer, Elena found herself reflecting often on how far the family had traveled since that first whispered insult at the engagement party months earlier. What had begun as a private cruelty, spoken in a language meant to protect the speaker from consequence, had ultimately unraveled decades of careful concealment, forcing an entire family to reckon honestly with a history they had spent generations avoiding. Diane Ashford, once cautious and reserved toward Elena, had grown noticeably warmer as the months passed, her earlier concerns about social standing and refinement gradually replaced by genuine curiosity about Elena's heritage and the strength of character that had allowed her to stand so firmly against Edmund's initial cruelty. She began asking Elena questions about the ancient tongue, about her grandmother's village, even expressing quiet interest in learning a few phrases herself, a gesture that Elena recognized as deeply meaningful, coming from a woman who had once seemed so committed to maintaining careful distance from anything unpolished or unfamiliar. Daniel, throughout this entire journey, had remained a steady and unwavering presence beside Elena, never once asking her to soften her stance or minimize the confrontation for the sake of easier family relations. He had grown too, in ways Elena found deeply moving, developing a newfound curiosity about his own family history, spending hours with his grandfather, listening to stories about the mountain village, asking questions he had never thought to ask before, gradually building a fuller, more honest understanding of where his family truly came from. One evening, several weeks before the wedding, Daniel surprised Elena by presenting her with a small leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with careful handwriting. He explained that he had spent the past several weeks secretly meeting with Edmund, recording as many stories, proverbs, and memories from the mountain village as his grandfather could recall, determined to preserve that heritage properly, rather than allowing it to fade further into forgotten history. He told her he wanted their future children to grow up knowing the full truth of where their family came from, unpolished struggles and all, rather than inheriting the same carefully curated silence that had shaped so much of his own upbringing. Elena held the notebook carefully, tears gathering in her eyes, as she flipped through pages filled with fragments of the ancient tongue, family recipes, old songs, memories of harvest festivals and difficult winters, survived through community and stubborn resilience. She realized, in that quiet moment, that the confrontation she had once viewed as necessary but painful had ultimately become a gift, not just for herself, but for an entire family finally choosing honesty over carefully maintained illusion. Edmund himself continued his gradual transformation throughout the remaining weeks before the wedding, becoming increasingly open during family gatherings about his own humble beginnings, occasionally even sharing stories in the ancient tongue with relatives who had never before heard him speak the language so freely. Rosalind, the distant cousin who had provided the crucial photographs months earlier, was invited to the wedding itself, a gesture that surprised many in the extended family, but delighted Elena, who recognized it as another meaningful step in Edmund's ongoing effort to reconnect with a heritage he had spent decades trying to erase. The night before the wedding, Elena sat with her mother in a quiet hotel room, the two of them reviewing final details, while soft music played from a small speaker nearby. Margaret told her daughter, with quiet pride, that she had never imagined the confrontation Elena described to her months earlier would lead toward such genuine warmth between their two families. She admitted that she had worried, initially, about her daughter marrying into wealth and privilege so different from their own modest life, fearing that Elena might feel pressure to hide or minimize her own background in order to fit more comfortably into that unfamiliar world. Elena reassured her mother that the opposite had happened entirely. Rather than hiding her background, she had used it as a foundation of strength, a source of pride rather than shame, and in doing so had helped an entire family rediscover the value of honesty over polished pretense. Margaret embraced her daughter tightly, telling her how proud she was, not just of the successful, educated woman Elena had become, but of the courage and integrity she had shown throughout this entire difficult journey. The following morning arrived clear and bright, the kind of perfect autumn day that seemed almost designed specifically for a wedding, golden light filtering through colorful leaves, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of nearby flowers. Elena dressed carefully in a gown that combined modern elegance with subtle traditional embroidery, inspired by patterns her grandmother had once shown her, a quiet nod to the heritage that had shaped this entire journey from the very beginning. The ceremony took place outdoors, beneath a large white arch decorated with autumn flowers and trailing greenery, rows of chairs filled with family and friends from both sides of Elena and Daniel's very different worlds. Margaret sat proudly in the front row, dressed in a simple but elegant dress she had chosen carefully for the occasion, while across the aisle, Edmund sat beside Diane, his expression soft, with an emotion far removed from the guarded formality he had carried through most of his life. Elena walked down the aisle on her mother's arm, having chosen, deliberately and meaningfully, to be escorted by the woman who had worked tirelessly to give her every opportunity in life, rather than following a more traditional arrangement. Whispers of admiration rippled through the crowd as she passed, her gown catching the afternoon light, her expression calm and radiant, carrying herself with the same quiet strength that had first challenged Edmund's cruelty months earlier, and ultimately transformed an entire family. Daniel waited at the end of the aisle, his eyes glistening as he watched her approach, unable to hide the depth of emotion written plainly across his face. When Elena finally reached him, taking his hands in hers, the officiant began the ceremony with words about love, honesty, and the courage required to build a life together, built on truth rather than illusion. Words that felt especially meaningful to everyone gathered, who understood the journey that had brought this particular couple to this particular moment. Midway through the reception that followed, held beneath a large open tent strung with warm lights, as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, Edmund rose from his seat and asked for everyone's attention, requesting the opportunity to offer a toast to the newly married couple. The room quieted, guests turning their attention toward the family patriarch, curious what he might say given everything that had unfolded over the preceding months. He began in English, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable warmth that had not always been present in his public speeches. He spoke about Daniel, about watching him grow from a curious child into a thoughtful, principled man, about the pride he felt witnessing his grandson build a partnership founded on honesty and mutual respect. Then, turning his attention toward Elena, his expression grew more vulnerable, more open than most guests had ever witnessed from him. He told the gathered crowd, without hesitation or shame, about his own humble beginnings in a small mountain village, about a family who had raised livestock on land barely large enough to sustain them, about the drought that had eventually driven him away in search of a different life. He admitted, openly and honestly, that he had spent decades hiding that history, believing it represented weakness, rather than the profound strength and resilience it actually reflected. He then switched, deliberately, into the ancient tongue, speaking slowly and clearly enough that even those unfamiliar with the language could sense its weight and significance. He told Elena, in the very language he had once used to insult her, that he had been wrong, completely and utterly wrong, to judge her worth based on her family's occupation, rather than her character, her intelligence, and her unwavering commitment to honoring truth even when it would have been far easier to remain silent. He told her that she had given him something he had not realized he desperately needed, permission to finally stop running from his own history, to embrace it fully rather than continuing to bury it beneath decades of careful reinvention. He raised his glass, switching back to English, and offered a toast not just to the newly married couple, but to honesty itself, to the courage required to speak difficult truths, even when silence would be far more comfortable. The tent erupted in warm applause, many guests visibly moved by the sincerity of his words, understanding, even those who had not witnessed the earlier confrontation firsthand, that something significant and meaningful had shifted within this family over the preceding months. Elena, tears gathering in her eyes, rose from her seat and embraced Edmund warmly. The gesture met with another wave of applause from the delighted crowd. The reception continued late into the evening, filled with dancing, laughter, and the easy warmth of two families who had, against considerable odds, found genuine connection through honesty, rather than continued division through pride and pretense. Beverly, though still somewhat reserved, offered Elena a stiff but sincere congratulations before the evening ended, a small gesture that Elena chose to accept graciously, understanding that not every relationship needed to be perfect in order to be meaningful progress. As the celebration wound down and guests began departing into the cool autumn night, Elena stood quietly beside Daniel near the edge of the reception tent, watching the last of the string lights flicker gently overhead. She thought about the whispered insult that had started this entire journey, about the anger and hurt she had carried quietly that first evening, about the careful, patient path she had chosen instead of immediate confrontation. She realized, standing there in her wedding gown beside the man she loved, surrounded by a family that had grown stronger and more honest through hardship rather than despite it, that some of the most painful moments in life carried within them the seeds of the most meaningful transformation, if only a person had the courage and patience to nurture those seeds, rather than letting bitterness take root instead. Years passed, and the story of that whispered insult, once a source of quiet pain, gradually transformed into one of the family's most treasured tales, told and retold at gatherings with warmth and even gentle humor, rather than lingering bitterness. Elena and Daniel built a life together filled with the same honesty and mutual respect that had carried them through those difficult early months, their partnership growing steadier and deeper with each passing year. Edmund, true to the promise he had made that day beside the lake, continued embracing his heritage openly, rather than hiding it, becoming something of an unofficial historian for the extended family, gathering stories, photographs, and memories from relatives scattered across the mountain region, before that knowledge could be lost entirely to time. He funded, quietly and without seeking credit, a small cultural preservation project in the very village he had once fled, helping restore an old community building where elderly residents could gather to teach the ancient tongue to younger generations, eager to reconnect with roots that had nearly disappeared. Diane, too, continued her own gradual transformation, developing a genuine friendship with Elena that neither of them could have predicted during those first tense months. She learned enough of the ancient tongue to hold simple conversations, delighting Edmund whenever she practiced new phrases during family dinners, and she became one of the strongest advocates within the family for honoring, rather than hiding, their complicated, humble history. Margaret continued running her farm for several more years, before eventually retiring, though she remained active, visiting Elena and Daniel often, forming an unlikely but genuine friendship with Edmund himself. The two of them frequently found deep in conversation about farming techniques, difficult seasons, and the particular satisfaction found in honest, physical labor. Their friendship became something of a family legend in itself, two people from vastly different circumstances, finding common ground through shared values rather than shared circumstance. Elena eventually became pregnant, and when her daughter was born, she and Daniel chose to give her a middle name drawn directly from the ancient tongue, a word that translated roughly to mean resilience, a quiet tribute to the language and the courage that had shaped so much of their shared story. As their daughter grew, Elena began teaching her fragments of the language herself, just as her own grandmother had once taught her, weaving old proverbs and lullabies into everyday life, ensuring that this precious inheritance would continue passing forward rather than disappearing into forgotten history. Edmund took particular joy in his role as great-grandfather, spending countless afternoons with the growing child, teaching her simple phrases in the ancient tongue, alongside stories about the small mountain village where his own journey had begun, so many decades earlier. He often told her, with a warmth that would have seemed impossible to imagine during those earlier guarded years, that true strength came not from hiding where a person came from, but from carrying that history forward with honesty and pride. At family gatherings in later years, it became something of a cherished tradition for Edmund to tell the story of that first engagement party, the whispered insult he had once believed completely safe from consequence, and the remarkable woman who had responded not with anger, but with patient, dignified truth that ultimately transformed an entire family's relationship with its own history. He told the story not with shame, but with genuine gratitude, recognizing it as the turning point that had finally allowed him to stop running from who he truly was. Elena, listening to him tell that story again and again over the years, always at ease when her role in it, felt a quiet satisfaction each time, understanding that the confrontation she had once approached with careful, patient strategy had ultimately given far more than it had taken. It had given an entire family the freedom to stop hiding, the courage to embrace their full history, rather than a carefully polished fraction of it, and a deeper, more honest foundation, upon which future generations could continue building their lives. Looking back, Elena often reflected that the ancient tongue, the very language Edmund had once used to insult her, believing it would remain forever hidden from her understanding, had ultimately become the bridge that connected their two families more deeply than either of them could have imagined that first difficult evening. What began as an attempt to diminish her had instead revealed her strength, and what began as a family's carefully guarded secret had instead become its most treasured and openly celebrated legacy, carried forward proudly by every generation that followed.